Welcome to the Gestalt Get Together, presented by SpeechTherapyPD.com. Each episode has its own accompanying audio course on SpeechTherapyPD.com and is available for 0.1 ASHA CEUs. The Gestalt Get Together is your podcast for discussing the state of the evidence of Gestalt language processing, associated therapy modalities, and how our field is responding to the frameworks of GLP and NLA. I'm Corinne Zmoos, MS, CCC-SLP, a musical language therapist who's dedicated to celebrating while investigating Gestalt language processing, protecting the scientific method, and reducing cognitive linguistic biases about this framework and these clients that I love so much. My areas of focus are psychoacoustics, music theory, and musical syntax in GLPs. Previously, I worked closely with key players in the GLP quote-unquote movement, but experienced concerns with the propensity for logical fallacies and resistance to quantitative inquiry in the larger community. I now identify myself as lovingly skeptical, and I hope that listeners will sharpen their ability to recognize linguistic choices that move a cause forward without strong evidence, what level of evidence we're actually dealing with, and where we need to go next to support these kids that we care about. So what can you expect from us? Our episodes will provide balanced and educational interviews about clinician experiences, live coaching and problem solving about therapeutic decision making with a healthy dose of musical language recommendations thrown in, discussions on the logical fallacies and cognitive biases that emerge when implementing a new approach, and even some elements of the BITE model that have emerged within the larger GLP movement. Most importantly, this podcast is intended to help you embrace, investigate, and analyze your unique role in child development for Gestalt language processors without getting in your own way. This podcast is a celebration of neurodivergent learning, and we look forward to you learning with us along the way. Hello and welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Gestalt Get Together, presented by Speech Therapy PD. This is your podcast for discussing the state of the evidence of Gestalt language processing, associated therapy modalities, and how our field is responding to the conceptualizations of Gestalt language processing, NLA, and associated information. Now, today I am excited to speak to Kathleen Oppenheimer, who is an SLP as well as a researcher, about her work investigating language processing. So let's have Kathleen introduce herself, and then we're going to start talking about her work and how that applies to Gestalt language processing. Kathleen, tell us about yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kathleen Oppenheimer. I'm a speech language pathologist. I'm not currently clinically practicing. I'm focusing on parenting right now. And I'm a PhD student at the University of Maryland, where I study language processing in children with primarily developmental language disorder and also typical language development. Before that, I was a speech language pathologist in a children's hospital for 4 years. I was treating pretty much across the scope of our practice, birth to 21. I did outpatient evaluations as well as inpatient brain and spinal cord injury work. So I've done kind of a broad range of things in my career. And I'm really interested in science communication, which is how we communicate science from the lab to everyone who's not in the lab. So I've previously done a lot of outreach work to, say, elementary school, middle school, high school students. I used to run a whole Instagram account about that at The Language Scientists. And now my outreach work is more focused on looking into the science behind Gestalt language processing and natural language acquisition, and using my background in the language processing research to interpret some of the research that's been talked about in those spaces.
Thank you so much for sharing more about your background. You've certainly seen a wide scope of our field. And I can imagine that you bring some of your experience from across those different settings into your work now. And so I do want to share something that, I think you and I have giggled about a little bit, in that when I first encountered your work, particularly on social media, I was quite defensive because I was looking at information and positions that I felt were grading against what I had created as kind of an identity for myself as a Gestalt language processor therapist. Oh,
And just
yes.
so we're clear, you're talking about my account at language_processing, not the
Yes,
account
I
I
am.
mentioned earlier for my previous work.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for clarifying. Yeah, I experienced this feeling of, and what I recognize now is I had almost adopted Gestalt language processing as a part of my identity as a clinician, or perhaps even further than that, which led to some interesting feelings coming up. And what I found since then is by really leaning into and considering the way that you've interpreted this information from a different lens, I have been able to arrive at a much more balanced approach to understanding the information in front of me, like the true state of, the current evidence that we have. And not only has it helped me make better decisions in the clinic, but it's also really pushed me to want to know more about the research that's going on, as well as how I can contribute to it. So I think it's so
Mhm.
interesting to think about my arc, how it started as really defensive, and now I can't stop learning about the gaps in my own thinking, my own biases, and I can't wait to learn more from you this evening.
Sure, yeah, and I think it's only appropriate that I follow that up with a brief explanation of my introduction to GLP, and which is that, I first encountered those terms on social media, which is where I think most people encounter those words for the first time. And my first thought was, oh, this is interesting. I never learned about it in school. And so it was with, open-minded curiosity to learn more and thinking like, oh, this is great. If there's a new method of supporting language development that I haven't heard about, I want to learn more. And so that's what got me digging into the research and then sort of, asking some questions. And I think as I've said on the account, there's things that I agree with, things that I don't agree with. And so, yeah, I'm excited to be here today. And thank you for having me on to talk about it.
All right, so today we are talking about evaluating the evidence for NLA and GLP using the EBP triangle. And I think it's only right to start talking about what is the EBP triangle as related to our field.
Yes. So everyone has seen this triangle image that Corinne put up. So the EBP triangle, I like to think of it, EBP, evidence-based practice, is a process for clinical decision making. So the triangle is really just a way of illustrating the components of that process. It's just a diagram as a kind of simplified representation of this really complex process that clinicians are undertaking every day as we're making decisions. And the different pieces are pretty interconnected. So sometimes even when I'm thinking through it, and I think about the triangle a lot, I give presentations on it to the undergrads I work with. There's pieces of evidence where I'll say, oh, it's kind of in this one and this one. So it's not just this clear cut, these three things, and then you make a decision. So I will start with external evidence and kind of go around. That's not because external evidence is more important than the others, but when we get to client perspectives, I think it'll make sense why I'm saving that for last. So external evidence is typically understanding the peer-reviewed research. So studies from journals. So not newsletter articles, not so much personal experiences, but systematic investigations typically conducted by researchers. And in our field, it's not uncommon for these papers to have a speech language pathologist as one of the co-authors. Many labs hire speech language pathologists to assist in their research. So even there, that line of clinician researcher is also not super clear cut. And this research can be qualitative or quantitative. So qualitative research deals with understanding people's experiences, motivations. Typically, the data there comes from like an interview to learn about someone's perspective, or maybe an observation to notice what's happening. And qualitative research helps us understand what's happening, but doesn't prove anything. It's a way of describing what we see. Quantitative research is any time you're counting or measuring your outcome. Any research that uses statistics, that would be quantitative. And it can be experimental, designed to prove a hypothesis or test a hypothesis, or it can be observational. So if you're doing something like, we want to know the average number of times a child initiates communication in an hour-long play setting, that would be quantitative, but observational, because we're just noticing what happens and counting and measuring it. We could make that experimental by saying, how many times do they initiate communication when we're playing with their preferred toy versus when I try to make them do a coloring page? So now I've manipulated something. I think manipulate can be a word that makes people have certain feelings, but we're not manipulating the child. Manipulate is just our experimental word for changing something about the environment, some kind of research or control. And so these papers can also be presenting novel data, so describing an experiment the researcher just did or a qualitative study they just did. They can also be review papers, which is where the researcher goes and reads all the papers about a topic that they can find and summarizes and synthesizes them for us. So those review papers can be really helpful for clinicians who don't have the time to go read 26 papers on a topic to try to sift through them. We can read the review paper where someone else did that work for us. And by publishing the review in a peer-reviewed journal, we know that there were extra sets of eyes on it, kind of checking over their work. So those sources of external evidence can tell us what works for a child, for what works on average. So that's always a good starting point, knowing that, treatment method A is more effective than treatment B for most kids. We want to start with treatment A unless we have a good reason not to, give ourselves the best chance of success. And it's still important to know the limitations of the study. Are there things about it that might make it apply more or less to a particular child? And sometimes papers, rather than telling us how to do therapy, research like the language processing research I'll talk about later, might just give us a broader understanding of how communication works. So then we can use that information to think critically with our clinical expertise, the next side of the triangle, to make better decisions. So even that evidence that's not directly about how to do therapy can still be really useful. And so I think of this a lot when I used to work where I saw a lot of kids with really rare genetic disorders. So maybe this was like the third child who'd been diagnosed with a specific condition. There's 2 papers on it, and they're just really intense molecular biology with maybe a paragraph that says, oh yeah, and their speech is delayed, right? So sure, there's no research on how to support communication in this 3-year-old, non-speaking 3-year-old who's in front of me, right? But that doesn't mean I just take every possible method of addressing a speech disorder and stick it in a hat and pull one out and say, well, anything goes, right? I want to use the best available evidence about how to support early communication development. I want to assess for a potential motor speech disorder as appropriate. The child isn't speaking. I'm going to offer AAC. We're going to involve the family in treatment. So this research papers that didn't include kids with this genetic disorder are still really relevant in the absence of research specific to the diagnosis of the kid in front of me. If new research comes out on supporting non-speaking children, I'm going to think about whether that should affect my treatment plan. And as I'm doing all this, I'm going to be clearly explaining everything I do to the family along with my rationale. So if the family is saying, well, what does the research on this disorder say? I don't just say nothing and leave it at that. I would explain the other aspects of my learning and the research that informs my current plan. And that's not to say that specific diagnoses aren't relevant to treatment. It's more that, having the diagnosis and diagnosis-specific research is helpful, but research that's not specific to that diagnosis isn't automatically useless. So before we move on.
I think I can,
No, go
I
ahead,
apologize
please.
for overlapping. I think I relate to something in that when we think about, and I'm also curious about your thoughts of what I say, I think about when I'm working with this, group of children or clients who we're referring to as Gestalt language processors, because there isn't really any quantitative research at this point that, or even the ability to operationalize this term yet. So much of what I'm doing and other clinicians who I've been speaking to are doing is we are, pulling from other disciplines and looking at the research from those disciplines to help support our decision making there. Yeah, sure, perhaps in the ASHA journals, we're not seeing anything related to, not anything, but we're not seeing anything related to the terms that everyone's using. But so much of that is I'm trying to bring in the information from other fields like psychoacoustics. I'm speaking more so to when we're speaking like claims about intonation or musicality, by being able to point to and pull from research that is supporting the underlying difficulties, similar to there's no papers about that particular diagnosis yet, except for the biological ones. Can we also look to pulling from information from other modalities or other disciplines, or getting more into the nitty-gritty of the why rather than just saying there's no evidence, which feels a little bit too simplistic, or relying so much or exclusively on that light blue or that teal part of the triangle.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I think research from other disciplines is great. My big caution about focusing too much on the why and then making a jump from the why to the treatment plan is that that's led us astray in the past. So sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So an example is we've found that, there's many various disorders or differences that are associated with poor working memory. And so for a while, there'd been a push of like, oh, we just train working memory and then the problems go away. And that didn't work. And so when we finally actually tested, these working memory interventions, they don't actually even improve working memory. So someone did have a really good research-based idea that was worth testing, and it didn't pan out. So that's not to say we should, again, in the absence of the perfect information we want, starting with the why and then making hypotheses about what might work in treatment is a great approach. And we just want to be careful not to get too far ahead of ourselves.
That's really helpful feedback. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for bringing that in. And, certainly though, I do want to emphasize that research from other disciplines is great. And I think, we can kind of triangulate what to do. So, maybe this other discipline tells us some hints about the why, but then a speech therapy paper about a similar population of kids might also tell us what might work. And so we can kind of, work with all of that together. And just one more kind of misconception maybe about quantitative research, so that experimental research that I wanted to touch base on before I move on to internal evidence, is that I think a lot of people have this idea that in these experiments, researchers are just splitting kids into two groups, and then we have them do something in a lab and we compare them. That might have been a more common trend in the past, but more and more researchers are shifting to studying individual differences. And many papers actually are entirely focused on individual differences. And there's been an explosion of new statistical methods to account for that. So this is not a podcast about math, so I am not going to bore you with my statistical methods. But I just want everyone to know that those methods are out there and they are being used. So that's an exciting new direction that many people are going in. So, going back to kind of our talking about, what do you do when the kid in front of you, we don't really have the perfect study telling us what to do. We make our best guess. We've educated the parents about why we're doing this. They've given informed consent to do it. And then we want to track the internal evidence. So that's essentially your treatment data. So you've picked your treatment plan, and then you want to monitor if it works and make changes accordingly. And I think sometimes in the social media discourse, we create this false dichotomy that you're connecting with the client or you're sitting there with your clipboard just taking data like a boring person. And I think that they don't need to be at odds, right? I think we can do both. And, we can create a connection with the client and take data. We're not taking data every single second of a session, but without that data, how do we justify our time and our treatment choices and the client's money if they're paying for this therapy, or if the client's getting pulled out of a class in school to be with us? How do we justify that what we're doing is better than them just being in that academic class if we don't have data to back it up? As I had a kind of personal story about how I saw this play out for me. So I was in the hospital in June for some scary stuff. I'm fine now. And I saw that my nurses were really doing both. So they were listening to me, validating me, making me feel safe and cared for. And man, they were charting stuff and measuring stuff and doing all the things they needed to do to make sure that I was physically safe and would be able to go home. And so, making sure I was responding to treatment, not having dangerous side effects. And so I think that, if in that kind of life or death, high stakes situation, they can connect and track data, I don't think there's really an excuse for us in our situations to not manage both. And of course, there's always that one session where everything's just a wreck and you just have to help the client get through the day. But on average, that data is important. That's how we show that our treatment works. And even if it's a super evidence-based treatment with, I'm putting quotes because I think evidence, I'm referring to the idea of those studies, those treatments that have, piles of papers behind them. That technique might not work for the kid in front of you. So you still need your data. So you can be like, whoa, why isn't this working? Let's fix it. And that internal data, it's really meant to evaluate your own client's progress, not to tell us what would work for other people. So we want to be careful about generalizing from our own or someone else's internal evidence. Okay, so clinical perspective, clinical expertise. So we're on to that magenta side. So this is how we synthesize information from multiple sources. So we might seek expert guidance. So in the ASHA journals, those might be the articles that are called tutorials, viewpoints, or clinical focus. So just because it's an article doesn't mean it's external evidence. If it's an article type that's an expert expressing their opinion or a consensus statement, that's clinical expertise. That's not external evidence. We might look at the ASHA preferred practice patterns, which are a wonderful resource that ASHA has put together for us. And then we use our own critical thinking based on our experience, our knowledge of related clinical questions, and prior knowledge about theory to make our best guess. So this is where it is important to consider those foundational sciences, your speech science, hearing science, language acquisition classes. So sometimes there's not enough evidence to say what works, but instead we can say what might work or what should work based on these other things we know. And then, of course, we go gather our internal evidence so that we can check if it actually works and make the changes we need to make.
I'm thinking about, you referenced different kinds of articles that may be pointed to as there's research, there's our research, we have research. And again, it just feels like another moment of this like black and white. It's like it is or it isn't. Like this is the research. But if they're, like you said, something like a consensus, does that actually support the decision-making process? Or is that an interpretation of the current state of what we're seeing and trying to learn about?
Right. Yeah. And so, if I'm getting up to speed on a new practice area, I might rely on that clinical expertise of some kind of expert consensus statement. Yeah, and it's certainly valuable, but yeah, it might be someone's summary of the research for me, but it's not the research itself. Yeah. So once we've done all that, now we're at the third side. So client and family perspectives. And I'm talking about this last, not because it's the most important or the least important, but because I think it actually depends on the other sides. So, because they all need each other, right? And I think of this part of the triangle as the perspectives of a fully informed client and family. So we want to understand and consider their circumstances, their values, their beliefs, their priorities, their preferences. But we also have a responsibility to teach them about what we know so that they can make an informed choice about their next steps. So we want to accurately describe different treatment possibilities. So, we could approach it this way or we could approach it that way. I'm not as good at this second one, so I'd refer out if that's what you want. We still have to tell them about those other options that are out there and the benefits and potential risks of all those alternatives. That's what informed consent means. And we owe it to our clients that when they're sharing their perspectives, those are fully informed perspectives and not, they might have heard about a treatment and then they come in saying they want it, but they don't know about the other treatments that are out there. And we want to make sure they still have a chance to learn about those. Sometimes, so we don't want to deprive them of the ability to make that choice by not having given them their options. And, being an expert doesn't mean we're telling the client what to do. It means we're making sure the client has the information they need to make the decision that's right for them without having to go frantically Googling it and without needing the media literacy to, sift through all those search results. So, I think we sometimes shy away from, we're not the experts. They're the experts on them. They are the experts on them. We're the experts on all this knowledge we learned in grad school about different treatment options. And that's what we have to share by laying that out for them.
Yeah, I think that relates to my own experience in my own clinical work where I'll have families reach out for a discovery call, a consult, wanting to work together, and they say, I would like for you to do NLA with my child. And I'm excited that they've heard about this approach or this concept, but also I would really, really love to meet you and your child and assess them before we make any decisions about how we're going to structure our work together. But yeah, it is interesting where that the request for a certain approach comes in. But exactly, what are all the other ways that we could approach the challenges that you're experiencing and the goals that you have for your child before jumping into the one that you're really, really excited about, which again, that's amazing that you come in knowing about something and you're excited about it. But without that information, I love what you say, that it's the perspective based on being fully informed. I've never heard it like that before.
Thanks. Yeah. And, and another place where I think about this is sometimes the opposite of what you describe happens, where a client comes in saying, oh, and we won't do this. And I think even then I'll say, I'm very consent based. So I say, I hear you. I don't want to try to convince you, but I would like to tell you some potential benefits of that. And would it be okay if I do that? Because again, I don't know why they're saying that this other thing is unacceptable to them when we haven't talked about it. And maybe they got completely wrong information, or, who knows until we talk about it. And so the other thing I wanted to say about client perspectives is that sometimes research on client perspectives can be research-based. So sometimes we have qualitative or quantitative research about client perspectives. And that's the one where I don't really know where on the triangle it goes. And I don't know how important it is to put it in the right place. There might be surveys of how parents feel about certain interventions. And maybe we see this overwhelming preference towards one particular thing. But again, we also need to consider that through the client in front of us. And we don't want to limit their options based on this overwhelming preference of other people. So, my personal story here is I hate needles. And so one year I go to get my flu shot and the nurse just holds up the needle for me. And I said, I don't like looking at needles. Can you just do it and not tell me anything? And she's like, oh no, I'm supposed to show you the needle because it's smaller than usual this year. And if I show it to you, it makes people less anxious. And I was like, I don't care. Please just do it and stop telling me about it. She's like, no, but the research shows that when you talk about, how it's actually really small, people get less anxious. And that's not a case where the evidence is wrong. It's probably very true that many people appreciate getting procedures explained to them. That's a misapplication of the evidence-based process of also listening to the patient in front of you who's saying, no, I'm an adult. I do this every year. I know what works for me. So, we want to get informed consent, respect opinions. It's complicated. We have complicated jobs.
All right. So with all that in mind, I want to move on to something that I really needed to learn about, and something that you have helped me learn about. It has changed the way I use these two words. And so we'd love to learn more about the terms theory and hypothesis, as well as the differences between the scientific definition, as well as the colloquial definition, which I hear all the time in most parts of my life, even at a coffee shop. Well, I have this theory so tell us more about how to define these.
Yeah, so these words get thrown around a lot, don't they? And it is normal and not bad for words to have multiple meanings, right? And most of the time this doesn't cause confusion, right? If I say oh, I was in a traffic jam, no one's like, why was there jelly on the highway, right? We accept that words have multiple meanings. And as someone who considers myself a scientist, I use these colloquially in colloquial context, and there's nothing wrong with that. And so what's tricky is when we're not really sure what meaning a person is using, or when we think a miscommunication might be the result of people using the same word different ways. So I promised 2 definitions of theory. We're actually going to do 3. So the informal colloquial definition of theory is like a hunch, right? Oh, she seems really happy lately. I have a theory. Maybe she's seeing someone new or whatever. But then in the social sciences, theories tend to mean like a framework for understanding a phenomenon. And so that an example might be family systems theory. That's what I learned about in my master's program. So the idea when you work with a person, they are part of a family and you want to address the family as a unit. So that's a social science theory where it's a framework for thinking about how we're going to do something, or a lens for interpreting something. We're not proving or disproving it. We don't have evidence proving family systems theory. We have evidence showing when we take an approach grounded in family systems theory, here's the kind of outcomes we get. And I don't think that's really a way we use theory much in discussions of NLA and GLP. I just did want to address that as another definition, just making this, even more complicated, right? And now our scientific definition for the physical and life sciences, so, biology, psychology, speech and hearing sciences. A theory is a broad explanation for a natural phenomenon, so a way of explaining something that occurs naturally in the world that's been rigorously tested, supported by substantial evidence, and has high predictive power.
Mm.
So the theory of evolution is used a lot as an example. So there's converging evidence for evolution from all kinds of scientific approaches. So it's supported by substantial evidence. It's been tested, so we can make testable predictions about evolution and see them borne out as we develop new methods. And it yields predictions. So not predictions in the sense of like, what will humans look like in a million years? But things like, maybe from looking at the fossil record, we make those trees of how animals are related from their bones. And then when we go do genetic testing on them, it shows that that relationship is there. So then we get to some confusion when you use this word theory colloquially in a context where maybe I'm expecting a scientific definition, because then someone says, oh yeah, I have this theory. But if you say it in a scientific context, maybe someone then comes back at you and says, that's not a theory. Or if that's a theory, where's your evidence for it? And then, now we're just talking past each other and getting angry without doing anything constructive with our disagreements.
Mm-hmm. I have a question for you, Kathleen, and I apologize if this is getting ahead of what you're about to say, but I'm wondering, for the scientific definition of theory, is it typically a convergence of different fields' evidence, or can it be derived from one field of study?
You would usually at least expect evidence from different research methods. So, like a theory of language acquisition might all come from linguistics and psychology, but it certainly shouldn't be contradicted by things elsewhere. Okay. So any theory of language acquisition, shouldn't be totally incompatible with what we know about biology, for instance.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
So yes, so we've got our theories. So then in social media, I've seen these cases where someone calls GLP, or Gestalt Language Processing, a theory. And, what are they saying? Is it their hunch based on what they've seen? So that would be the colloquial definition. Is it, something that is a framework for thinking about communication? That might be more of a social science definition. Are we making the claim that it is, an explanation for language that's backed by significant evidence? And if that's the case, show me the evidence is a really reasonable way to respond to someone presenting a scientific theory. That's how the scientific process works. We make a claim and we back it up with evidence. And so I think that at least making sure we're defining our terms the same way can go a long way towards having those productive conversations.
I'm wondering about when it comes to, and this is a whole big other conversation, when it comes to social media communication about our field, there's so much we can say about it. I know that even in the UK, there are significant restrictions about what at least speech pathologists, or they call them speech therapists there, what they can communicate through social media because of, the inherent risks. And so I'm thinking about, at least just on social media, is the word, and now the thing I know about you is you're not going to have a black-white answer. But when you think about the application of the word theory, do you feel like that is even a useful word to be using when we're communicating in quick sound bites and snappy captions? Or do you feel like that can, be a sticky term to be using?
I love that question. And I think you're right. It's a very sticky term. And when we think about science communication, we think about clarity and not just being technically right, but, going out of our way to avoid leaving someone with a potential miscommunication. So back when I was doing more presentations, I would go into elementary school classrooms to teach about linguistics, basically. We would test drive our presentations for other adults and our audience would just try to come up with every single way that someone could misinterpret anything we said in a way that might leave them with like a negative belief about language.
Mm.
And we would just workshop and workshop and workshop until we felt like we couldn't find anything that someone could misconstrue and take away negative impressions about other people, right? Certainly
Mm.
they can misunderstand whatever they want. And I think about that too when I communicate on social media, that, yes, maybe I'm not going to make sense to some people. Maybe I'm not going to make sense to a lot of people, but I try to be really careful that whatever I do say has really that I've really tried to minimize the ways it could be misinterpreted in a way that could do harm, using harm very loosely here,
Mm-hmm.
right? Leaving
Yeah.
someone with incorrect information, leading someone to make a choice about their child that I didn't even anticipate I'd be influencing.
Yeah. And I think this might be branching off a bit, so feel free to bring me back in. But I think even the verb choices that we use related to things like theory, hypothesis in social media communications, I do see a lot of language choices related to GLP and NLA about this will happen or something that will, or speaking about GLPs, about the things that feel, I'm not sure how to phrase this, instead of words like could or
Mm-hmm.
might or may, but these ideas of GLPs can, GLPs will. And there's a similar feeling I get and listen, that used to be me. I really did a deep dive in all of my communications and really had to take a look at the way I was being trying to be very clear and trying to be really like proud and
Mm-hmm.
confident, and just the recognition of what is that based upon? And so I'm curious about when you see the language of will versus might or could, what comes up for you?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up because I hadn't thought of that. But yes, I think, there's, again, if our goal is clarity, we want to make sure that we're using words that are appropriate for the strength of evidence we have.
Mm.
Right. And there are times when saying will and that certainty is appropriate. Speech therapy prognosis, like, no, that's not the time for it.
Mhm.
But, if I drop my water bottle, it will fall on the ground, right? That's a great place for will. And so, even in our sound bites and our cute little infographics, making sure that our language isn't implying a degree of certainty that we don't have,
Mhm.
and being comfortable with uncertainty. And, going back to I say my work on science communication is more extensive thinking and reading, but we also talk about how scientists tend to really want to hedge their bets when they're making a statement. So they use a lot of may, can, maybe. And doctors kind of tend to do this too. I forget exactly what I had called the pediatrician about for my first kid. Something like totally innocuous that I was stressed out about. And she goes, "Oh, he'll probably be okay." And that's just how they talk. Right? And but you don't want to hear probably, but because they hesitate to
Mm-mm.
say will, because then if they're wrong, that's really bad for them. So, and scientists always want, a big part of science is being uncertain and
Mhm.
reducing that uncertainty, but we never get rid of it. Science isn't about saying this is absolutely how things work. So so we also end up with these communication mismatches where maybe a statement to the public is something like, "Oh, this will probably work." And the public
Mhm.
hears that as they don't know what they're talking about because we want to hear that will or,
Mhm.
that absolute language. So those words, as much as I want us, and I think we should be more careful about being accurate with those words, it's also something we talk about a lot in science communication spaces, that we can make it sound like we have no idea what we're talking about when we actually do, just because of how those words get interpreted in different contexts. So,
Yeah.
maybe instead of trying to be really careful with like a will may distinction in our writing, we want to just use a couple more words to flesh out
Mm.
the degree of evidence and certainty that we have to, again, reduce the ambiguity in our communication.
Mm. I think you're speaking to something about just that human desire for answers, especially when we're thinking about children and families who really, they want help, and clinicians who really, really want to help. And that uncertainty is so uncomfortable. And so I think it can be really compelling to see information or ideas
Mhm.
that have that confidence, that present with, and also I know this for myself and I'm really trying to fight it in my own social media presence. There's something extremely rewarding about getting a lot of likes and a lot of comments. And those,
Mhm.
in my personal experience, tend to come a bit more like a waterfall when I'm sounding a bit more definitive about my ideas. So there's this, interesting
Mhm.
relationship between like the reinforcement that comes in with certain verbiage.
That's so true. I laugh because Instagram likes to give me advice on getting more engagement for my account. And it's all those kinds of things. And I'm like, no, I intentionally choose not to do these things
Mm,
that Instagram thinks I should do. It's not about the likes. So I think we should briefly talk about hypothesis. Here,
yes.
the two definitions are more similar. So a scientific hypothesis is a testable prediction. So you have enough evidence that you can, justify your hypothesis, and it's narrow enough that you can test it. So maybe when we talk about eye tracking research next, a testable hypothesis about Gestalt language processing could be, in this study, I predict this result from someone who is a Gestalt language processor and this result from someone who isn't. I will preview in the cases where those studies have been done, we actually don't see a difference. We don't see data supporting a difference in processing style for the studies that have been done so far. But that would be a testable hypothesis. So I'll give those examples as we get there. And then again, colloquially, it just kind of means a guess. So it might be a guess where you'll later find the answer over the course of time, but not necessarily that testable experimental sense that it has in science.
Mm. All right. Well, then, I'd love to know more about this because this is not my wheelhouse. I hope for it to be one day, but can you tell us more about methods in language processing research?
Sure. So we should start by defining language processing. And in general, it refers to the cognitive strategies or the things happening in your mind and brain that are engaged when you're doing language. So we don't see processing happening. We see the result of language processing. You have to process language to talk. So you're seeing the result of my processing right now. When you ask a kid to point to the ball and they point to the ball, you're seeing the result of them having processed what you said, but you're not seeing the processing. Um, and so we don't just want to know what someone understands, we want to know how they're getting to that understanding. So here's an example. If I say the cat was chased by the dog, you all know that the dog did the chasing. But in language processing research, we don't just care that you got to understanding what happened when I ask you to point to a picture or act it out with some toys. We want to know how you figured that out. And so adults and typically developing children as young as 2 years old, so this is a really early developing skill, show something called the agent first bias. So they predict that the first noun they hear is going to do the thing. So they hear the cat was, and they're already forming this idea that the cat is doing something. When they hear the cat was chased, and now maybe they're predicting that the next word will be mouse, right? Because you're making these predictions, that understanding of language as you go. So we call that incremental parsing, where you're coming up with your parse or your grammatical understanding incrementally, word by word as you go. And then we get to the cat was chased by the dog. And at that point, you're like, oh, by, that means it's a passive. So the cat wasn't chasing. And you revise your prediction to get to the right answer. And so in language processing research, we're trying to figure out what are those moment by moment steps? Who's doing them? When? What? How can we push them around, right? Can we make that agent first bias so strong that you end up choosing the wrong answer at the end? How do we do that, right? Or can we make it weaker so you're better at understanding passive sentences? How do we change those things about comprehension? So that's some of what we're doing. And we also ask questions about the different factors that might impact language processing. So language exposure, cognitive factors like working memory, processing speed, executive function, features of the sentence itself can all impact the strategies we're using as we're understanding. So I actually think this is a case where language processing is kind of used similarly scientifically and also in GLP, ALP discussions, because much of what I hear, and correct me if I'm wrong, Corinne, in Gestalt language processing is that these are kids who process language in chunks. So rather than going word by word to figure out what's happening, they're doing some kind of chunk-based processing, whereas an analytic language processor, and again, these are not terms I use in my research or that most people use in research, would be doing that word by word process that I was explaining with the cat was chased by the dog example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're referring to it at least because what I'm always trying to do is figure out the general conversation going on. Because if we're, so much of this has blown up through social media. And so what I've been trying to do is get that, what's a word for it? Like, I can't even think of a good word. It's just trying to like get that bird's eye view of what is everybody talking about Instagram? What's going on in that giant Facebook group? What are the conversations happening? Like there's so many different places where all these conversations are happening. And then it's really watching like this amorphous thing develop over time. But I'd say currently, because it's shifted a lot in the last few years, and I think it's going to continue to shift. Currently, I think, the way you're referring to it is what generally agreed upon, that what is, conceptualized as analytic language processing is being able to process these small units that are referential, like a single word that refers to something. Whereas Gestalt processing is referring to, in particular, these larger emotion-based multisensory chunks of information that can be called upon in a context that has a similar multisensory set of cues. And so it's not just cup. It might be calling upon a YouTube video where there's that, the processing of a lot of things that's going on. So more so than just, the string of sounds. It's related to so much more going on behind it.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that. So yeah, how do we study language processing? So I'll be talking about eye tracking as the method today because that's really the most popular one for young kids who can't or won't, answer questions reliably. Even a typically developing 3-year-old who can answer questions is not going to do that for you reliably in a research study. So for eye tracking, there's a bunch of different specific paradigms within eye tracking. I'll name them just so you've heard them, but I'm just going to call it all eye tracking today. Visual world paradigm, intermodal preferential looking paradigm, looking while listening. Those are some big ones, but I'm just going to call it all eye tracking today. So it's based on the idea that we tend to look at the thing we're thinking about. So, and this happens automatically, and it's not something people are aware of as they're doing an experiment. Like when I debrief my participants after doing a study, they'll tell me, I was definitely looking at the wrong picture because those sentences were confusing. And I'll just like pull up a graph of their results and say, no, actually you were looking at the right picture. So you're really not controlling it or aware of what you're doing. Certainly you could if you decide to mess with my data, you could just tell yourself, I'm going to look at the right side of the screen the entire time. And yes, you can absolutely control your eyes to do that. But unless you're trying to mess with me, if you're just cooperating and saying, yes, I will look at the screen while I listen to your sentences, you're going to look at the picture you're thinking about. So if we go back to my cat was chased by the dog example, maybe we have a picture of a cat, a dog, and a mouse. And so I say the cat, your eyes kind of are mostly looking at the cat. Now, not totally staring. We do still see a lot of movement around, but if we've got 3 pictures, more than a third of your looks are at the cat. Was chase? Oh, okay, the cat is chasing. Maybe you're looking at the mouse now because you've done that processing of cat chase. I know what's happening here. And then, by the dog, now you realize, oh, the dog is the one to look at. So then you shift again. So we can use where you're looking to make inferences about what expectations you're forming about what you're hearing.
Yeah. And Kathleen, I'm wondering, is this the study you're referencing? Is that one that we do have access to those nice visuals for?
Yes.
Okay, great.
So yes, we have pictures.
Yeah. And then this is referring to the looking while listening paradigm that you mentioned.
Yes. Yeah, that's
Great.
one of the eye tracking paradigms. So this is an example here. Again, this is not a particular study I can point to a citation for. This is just an illustration of what you might use it for. For kids, we typically only have 2 pictures on this screen. For adults, we can go up to and so for a young kid, which is what these studies that I'm talking about will be, it's typically a big screen, like a big screen TV kind of thing, with a picture on either side. So maybe a ball and a shoe, like this example. And then there'll be a camera that measures where the kid's eyes are looking. Sometimes it's a regular old video camera where a lucky research assistant then gets to watch it frame by frame to code where the eyes are looking. Sometimes we use something fancier that tracks that automatically.
Mm.
And then we might say, if we're just looking at vocabulary, wow, a ball, look at the ball. And then we can measure where the child is looking. And that's a way of getting a sense of, do they know what a ball is? They don't have to point, so they don't have to socially engage with the examiner. They don't have to follow directions. They just have to kind of sit still to look at the screen. And typically between trials, they get some really fun animation that keeps their attention. They can sit on their mom's lap or parent's lap. The parent will just wear like blacked out sunglasses and headphones so that they're not influencing the child. We can even make this portable and do it in the child's home so that it's like maximally comfortable for the child. And again, doesn't depend on them, following directions, where we get all those confounds of, well, did they just not want to do it today? Were my directions boring?
Yeah.
So we do try to make the videos really fun.
That's so interesting, just briefly, about like how, even without realizing, that a caregiver could provide very subtle, unintentional cues about where to look or orient.
Yeah, and we do a lot to minimize confounds here. So we've got that with the caregiver. We might have the ball appear on the left half the time and the right half the time. We have the correct answer on the left half the time and on the right half the time, so that if they have a preference for one side, we try to balance the color brightness of the 2 images so we don't get confounds from there. I'm not going to list everything we do to control in these, but it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's apply this to, our clinical decision making.
Great.
So let's see. So this first one, I think we can just do without, if you can just go back maybe to the previous picture that doesn't have as many labels.
Of course.
There we go. That one. Okay. Next one. Sorry.
Of course.
There we go. So I'm going to talk about a paper by Dr. Courtney Vanker et al. 2019, and I'll send you all these links, Corinne, for the show notes. So this is our first example of applying a finding from language processing research to our clinical decision making. Now, I don't know these authors. I don't think they set out to test a hypothesis about GLP in particular, but I think we might be able to interpret the results in light of some things that are being said about GLP and ALP. So they wanted to look at how autistic kids used verb meanings to understand sentences. So for each trial, the kids saw 2 pictures on the screen. Shoe wasn't one of their words, but we can pretend it was for the sake of this example. So ball and shoe. And then they hear a sentence that either contains a neutral verb, like look at, that doesn't give a clue to what I'm talking about, right? If I say look at the ball, you got to wait till I say ball before you know which one, because you could be looking at either one. Or they get an informative verb, like open the, or, throw the ball, where you could throw a shoe, so they probably wouldn't do throw the ball with shoe as the foil. Maybe like wear the shoe could be an informative verb for shoe, where from the verb, you really know which one I'm going to talk about. And so a child, they had 20 autistic 4-year-olds do this task. And so if a child is parsing incrementally, so they're understanding as they go, then when they get that informative verb, wear they should look at the shoe before I even say shoe, or soon after. If they're waiting until the end of the sentence before, coming to a conclusion, then they wouldn't get that head start from the verb. Whereas if I'm saying in a neutral condition, look at the ball, nothing about the verb gave a clue, so it should take longer. Even if you are parsing incrementally, it doesn't matter. You don't get a head start from the verb. So in that neutral condition, we're expecting it should take longer for their eyes to settle on the correct picture. And they should get a head start if the verb is informative, if they're using verb meaning and going word by word. If they're not using verb meaning, then maybe they, it doesn't matter what condition, regardless of the verb, they're going to look at the same time. Does that make sense? Okay, tell me in the chat if it doesn't. And so, what do you think? And so they did 24 trials of neutral, so look at or find, 24 trials of an informative verb. All the nouns were like really, really common nouns. And they split the task across 2 days. So this is another way that we can make these tasks more accessible to young kids. They don't have to do it all at once. Very unclear. Okay, so I'll try explaining this again. So if we have this ball and shoe, and I say, look at the shoe versus wear the shoe. If I say wear the shoe, you should look at the shoe faster. Should take less time because I'm going to say shoe before I even get to shoe because you can't wear a ball. Whereas if I say find the shoe, you don't really know until I've said that word what I'm talking about. Does that help?
I think for me, as we're waiting for feedback about the clarity there, what helped me was thinking about the two different, and there might be more categories. The idea of what you said, an informative verb versus like a neutral verb are those the two that you shared?
Yeah.
Because that helps me kind of start to create a tree in my head about what are all the verbs that could help. It's almost like there's that clear connection between almost the category of things that they can be related to. I don't know if it's that simple, but like when I hear the verb wear, there is a set of terms that I feel like I'm primed to think of. Or like kick there's a set of things that I might imagine, or a set of, nouns that typically follow that. And so, whereas what you're saying about neutral ones, really anything could fill in there. Am I
Exactly.
that? Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Right. So yeah, you can't make a prediction, so you just got to wait. And so, but you can only take advantage of that verb meaning to make a prediction if you are using a word by word process of understanding sentences. And so what they found is that on the whole, kids did get that head start. So these autistic 4-year-olds got a head start from the verb. They were using the verb to make an early prediction about the final word. And not only that, but kids with higher receptive language scores from standardized testing, they got an even bigger head start. So that kind of goes back to that tree you were talking about, Corinne, where the more you know about your words, the more you can take advantage of these informative clues. So that's my first paper. So again, that doesn't necessarily tell us what to do in treatment. But if we're thinking about, are these kids processing language in chunks, or are they processing language word by word? The evidence from this study kind of points to that word by word processing. And it also shows that there's this congruence between this eye tracking measure and the standardized test scores. So standardized tests are not perfect. They're not the end all be all of any diagnosis. And there are absolutely cases where we shouldn't use them for various reasons. But I think it, hints towards, a teeny tiny step of evidence towards supporting that there's something meaningful there. If we have two very different ways of looking at language that correlate. So let's do our next study. So this one is, this study. So if you could go to the visual for that. So this is a study by Goodwin et al. In 2012. And it's called Comprehension of WH Questions Precedes Their Production in Typical Development in Autism Spectrum Disorders. And it looked at the relationship between comprehension and production of simple WH questions. So what and where questions. They had 13 autistic kids, 18 neurotypical kids. So this is it's a small sample for sure, but it is really hard to get this data. And they had the kids do the same task at 4 study visits, 4 months apart. So this is a longitudinal study where we get to look at development over time. So the whole study was over a year, right, that the kids were enrolled. The autistic kids were about 3.5 at the beginning of the study, and then the Neurotypical kids were 2.5 because they were matched on language scores. So the autistic kids in the study did have a language delay. And so at each visit, the kids did a language sample where they played with their mother for 15 minutes with no structure, just kind of whatever felt natural to them, and then a 15-minute structured play sample where the researchers gave them particular toys. And the samples were transcribed and then coded for whether kids were producing WH questions and for MLU. So those are our language sample measures. MLU, mean length of utterance, and whether the kids were producing questions. And then we have the eye tracking task, which is what this visual goes with. So the kids sat on their parents' lap, facing a large screen in their home. So they're in their comfortable environment. And they only did 8 trials at each visit. So this is a good way of accommodating their attention span. And at each trial, they saw a silent video of an object acting on another object. So in this picture, for this trial, it's just an apple hitting a flower. No sound, no narration. They're just watching the video. And after that plays, they then see 2 still images. So just a picture of an apple on one side and a flower on the other side of the screen. And they hear a question. So sometimes the question asks them to find an object. So where is the apple? Where is the flower? And for that question, the correct answer is the thing you named in the question, right? Where is the apple? The answer to get it correct means you looked at the apple. You looked at the thing I said. So you don't even need to know anything about questions, right? Even if all you're doing is like, oh, apple? Yeah, I can look at an apple. You don't need to be using grammar or anything in that condition with the where question. But then they also had what questions. So the other half of trials, they either got what hit the flower, where the answer would be the apple. So they have to look at the thing that wasn't named. Or it would be what did the apple hit, where the answer is the flower. Again, the thing I didn't name. So those 2 what questions go together and the 2 where, right? So we're comparing what questions and where questions. So in these particular questions, the answer to the what question is not named, right? What did the apple hit? The answer is the flower. I didn't say that in the question. Whereas the where questions, where is the apple? The answer is the apple, the thing that I said. And so we use their looking patterns where they're looking to interpret their answer to the question. So if they're looking at the flower, we think, okay, that's their answer. And again, this is great because it doesn't demand that they actually engage in answering a question. We're not asking them to point. They're just watching a movie. And again, between the trials, they get like a really fun animation to make it very exciting for them. Okay, so let's see what they found. So on average, the neurotypical kids understood the what questions, the harder ones, around 54 months of age, as measured on this task. So that's 4.5 years old. Oh, sorry, that's the autistic kids. The neurotypical kids understood it at 32 months, so around 2.5. They were understanding these questions. Autistic kids understood them at around age 4.5, so later. But we can ask more than that. We don't have to stop at just saying it happened later. We can also look at, what else was happening for that child. So both groups had the same MLU in their language samples when they started understanding these WH questions. And these kids also understood these questions before they started producing questions. So if we're making a hypothesis that we can use expressive language to infer what kids are understanding, this research would contradict that because we actually had a way of showing, they're understanding things before they're saying them. So there's a lot of, there's some ideas that in autism, expressive language develops faster than receptive. This research would contradict that because we found receptive, that understanding of the questions developing faster than their expression. And we saw the same pattern of development in both the autistic and the neurotypical kids as well. So I think that's interesting for, if we had only studied the language samples, we wouldn't know that they're understanding these things that aren't in their language samples. And I think it highlights the importance of not assuming too much about comprehension from what we see in expressive language, and making sure that we're identifying appropriate methods for researching comprehension. I think we all know that there's things that aren't so great about some standardized tests. And so even if there's problems with the standardized test for a given child, there might still be research methods that do let us draw better conclusions about comprehension, at least at the group level.
Mhm.
Yeah. And like this is not a method you would use to assess comprehension of like one particular child for treatment planning. We don't have the evidence to use these tasks as at an individual child basis for diagnosis or treatment. These are really just for understanding in general, how is communication developing? Or, for testing hypotheses that might come out of, common ideas about how to do therapy. We can test those with these methods.
Yeah, this is something I'd be really curious to, because there's so many big questions when it comes to this, ideas behind Gestalt language processing that I feel excited about the use of eye tracking to pursue that.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And, because I think it gets easy to say, oh, you can't research this or no one's researching this. And, that's really just the limits of our creativity. And, I don't think I would be creative enough to like invent eye tracking as a method, but, we don't know what's out there until we actually go see what people are doing.
Yeah. And I think also just briefly that's where some of my frustration or concern comes from, is that just because it would be really hard to do it and doesn't mean that it's not worth pursuing. And kind of that pushback to, we don't need more research or we have enough, when the depth of information and what we could potentially do with that, at least in my opinion, is worth that, doing like coming up with really complicated ways of studying it.
Right. And, and we're also, when we're presenting an idea, making sure that we're aware not just of the evidence for it, but the evidence against it, and presenting those side by side, because ultimately what we want is to do the best for our kids, to do right by the children on our caseload and their families. And, that means being open to, maybe there's some evidence out there that completely contradicts what I've been taught, and, learning from that too. Okay. So we've got our last one. So I think this would be if we could go back to the ball shoe picture, but the one that has the word blanked out with the white box for our last study. Okay. So yes, so here, this is our last study, Kadar et al. 2006. So this is a 2006 paper. It's called Getting There Faster, 18 and 24-month-old infants' use of function words to determine reference. So that's a bunch of fancy title words. But so this is I like this paper because I see a lot of people in our field using what's called telegraphic input in speech therapy, or advising parents to use telegraphic input. So telegraphic input is those sentences, like kind of how people would write in telegraphs, where you just have your main important nouns and verbs and nothing else. So maybe you're saying baby drink milk instead of the baby drinks milk or something. So you're omitting morphology. Or look ball instead of look at the ball. Excuse me. Nope. Okay, no sneeze. Okay. And it's contrasted with simplified grammatical input, which is where you use the full grammar of a sentence, but you're still maybe using shorter sentences, right? So in simplified input, maybe you're saying drink the milk or let's drink the milk instead of, wow, let's go to the fridge where we keep the milk and take it out, right? That's probably too much to be modeling for some kids. And a recent survey found that most SLPs surveyed used telegraphic input at least some of the time in their therapy. But we actually have a bunch of converging evidence that kids learn better from fully grammatical input, where we're keeping in those function words like the and the morphology. And so this is a processing study that shows an advantage to including those words. So that's why we're talking about this study. And when I talk about processing studies, I do like to kind of talk through the exact methods, because I think otherwise it's just hard to even know what happened. So that's why I do kind of explain exactly what the screens looked like. So this was a study just of neurotypical kids. They had 18-month-olds, so kids a year and a half old, and 2-year-olds, exactly 24 months, with super tight age ranges. So I think the 24-month-olds were really like 23 to 25 months, not a lot of variability there. And they would see 2 pictures on the screen that were familiar to the child, so maybe a shoe and a ball. And then they would hear a statement, Like usually we do an attention getter first. So like, wow. And then our sentence. So it would either be, can you see ball? So that would be telegraphic because we're omitting a morpheme. We're omitting the word the. Can you see the ball? So that would be simplified grammatical. And then they had two others where they just did other words there. So like, can you see and ball? And then I think they used el, so the Spanish determiner, but none of the kids knew Spanish. Can you see el ball? El ball? To compare. And so what they found is that kids actually looked at the ball faster. So faster processing when we had the there. And then the other three were kind of all the same. So a little bit slower, like tied for second place. So when we use this grammatical input, kids understand faster. So to me, and again, we don't want to go too crazy making a jump from one study of neurotypical kids in a lab to treatment, but we also don't want to say, who cares what happened in the lab, right? It's again, that balance. It's not black and white. And so we see, and then they replicated this study on 12-month-olds and kind of got the same pattern. So what we see, though, is that really early kids have these expectations about how their language works. 18-month-olds aren't using articles like the reliably, but they're understanding them and they expect them to be there when they're listening, and they understand faster when you use them. And so eye tracking is the right method here, because if all we did was say, point to the ball, point to ball, point to and ball, they'd probably point to the ball in all of those cases, because with the eye movements, they did look there eventually. But this lets us see, we get faster processing. They look faster. So there's something meaningful about using the morphology. And so I think, it's worth, considering this knowledge when we're thinking about our treatment decision making. And, language is patterns, right? Grammar is a pattern. So if we use telegraphic input, we're taking some of those patterns away. We're giving the kids less information to use to learn the patterns of their language. We're taking away the grammatical patterns, but they're supposed to be figuring out grammatical patterns. And that doesn't really make a lot of sense from the perspective of theory. So eye tracking says, yeah, there's something good about including the grammatical pieces. Theory says, we want them to learn the patterns that are grammar. We should probably use those patterns when we're talking to them. And then there's even treatment studies showing that kids learn sentence structure better or the same when you use fully grammatical input versus telegraphic. So and I just wanted to include that.
Yeah, and I think that, well, first, and that seems to be related to the idea of statistical learning.
Yeah.
Because I know that's something that really stood out to me very early on in my career. I was like, that is such a helpful way of thinking about early language acquisition. But I think what's interesting about this article, and I find it really compelling for those who are working with GLPs, thinking about them, is that my perception of a wider consensus, again, filtered through social media, is that including the morphemes is being used pretty extensively, and that staying away from telegraphic, at least when we're thinking about and I know we're thinking about this idea of stage 3 when it's ball down, that shifts a little bit. But for me, this is, and again, big stretch to support, but this relates to some of my decision making about early models for what is called stage 1. I'm not going to be doing cup, I'm trying to think of let's see, cup up. I can't even think of a good example on the spot. Not as good with that. But when I'm thinking about providing these really highly intoned models, I'm not leaving out the articles. I'm not leaving out other morphological markers. Those are all included because I'm thinking about exactly the way that it's supporting the efficiency of the processing, as well as how it's going to help us later on when that early grammar starts to appear, because now they've got, I guess, what could be, the receptive relationship with those patterns. So I can see a connection there for the early stages of modeling, but I see where that may, fall apart when it comes to the ideas around that stage 3 modeling.
Yeah, interesting. Right. And I love your mention of statistical learning. There was a corpus study. So that's a study where you analyze a ton of transcripts of data, which is actually a quantitative method because you're typically, counting or measuring something about the transcripts that looked at speech to children, so child-directed speech, and they found that most of the time after the word the next word is a noun, which makes sense because the indicates a noun. The only time the next word wouldn't be a noun is if it's an adjective, right? The green door, the next word is green, not door, but a huge percentage of the time, the next word is a noun. So maybe kids kind of use that to sort of figure out, oh, I can find nouns now, right? Because we have this huge problem in early language acquisition of language just comes at you. There's no spaces in spoken language. How do you find the words? And the answer is prosody. And then also kind of breaking into these patterns. If we can figure out the thing after the is usually a noun, maybe now I can find some more nouns from the input and then use those to find other words. So the process is called bootstrapping, kind of using what you know about the grammar to sort of figure out more. And we see that with verbs too, that kids use information about verbs to learn nouns. So yeah, every little bit we learn helps us learn the next piece, which is pretty cool.
That's definitely a term that stuck with me and I still talk about a lot, the syntactic bootstrapping. It's like, it's really,
we should have
helpful.
included the syntactic bootstrapping paper.
We've got so much we could talk about. So
yes.
much.
Okay, well, should we talk about validity and reliability?
Yeah, let's touch on those.
Okay, so our last topic is validity, reliability, and clinical relevance. Did you want to kick us off with a question or did you want me to just start talking?
I say just let's dive right in for the sake of time, as well as my eagerness to learn more.
Sure. So I want to talk about what it means for a measure to be reliable and valid, particularly as it relates to NLA and GLP, because I think these are also words that carry some emotional valence, right? If someone says, oh, that's not valid, right? We're not invalidating anyone's feelings here. If something's not reliable, we're not saying you're an unreliable person. These have very particular meanings that I want to talk about. So reliability has to do with the overall consistency of a measure. Right? If I'm doing something, say NLA scoring to figure out what stage a kid is at, right? Do I get the same result every time? And we also need to know that this measure can be used the same way by different therapists, right? Because if I'm administering a test and I say, oh yeah, you definitely have this diagnosis, and then Corinne administers the same test, and she's like, oh yeah, definitely not, right? What did that test do? Why are we using that test if we can't administer it the same way? So one thing we look at is inter-rater reliability. So that's if two people give the same test, how often do they get the same result? And there's a bunch of different mathematical calculations for doing that. So if you're reading a paper and you encounter reliability, you might see all kinds of different words to describe it. I wouldn't get too bogged down in where those come from, but that is something you want to be thinking about. So anytime we're using any kind of measure, we always want to know inter-rater reliability. And research and clinical practice. So in research too, if I'm transcribing a language sample for research, I'm going to have someone else transcribe maybe 10% of my transcripts so we can show that I'm a reliable transcriber and you don't just have to take my word for it. And certainly something like a standardized test, we want to show that multiple SLPs who read the instructions and administer it can get to the same result. Otherwise, it's not a useful test. So, and there's a lot of decisions to be made about how to calculate it. So if you're thinking of transcription reliability, right? Is this word by word? What percentage of words do we both write? Is this line by line? What percentage of utterances did we transcribe exactly the same way? So we have to be thoughtful in our decision making and in our reporting that we're explaining exactly how we did it. And best practice might be to calculate it multiple ways and lay them all out for the reader to make their own interpretation. So, I think about that for something like NLA scoring, right?
Yeah.
If two clinicians have all the same background information on the client and observe the same language sample, do we have data that they arrive at the same score? Because how can we administer, provide language support based off of this scoring if clinician to clinician variability is too high? And so that's like a really early research question that requires time and effort. I don't want to underestimate that, but it's not a clinical trial. It's much simpler than that. or even identifying a child as a GLP. Do we have a reliable way of doing that? So if two clinicians are assessing the same child, will they arrive at the same conclusion?
Yeah. Especially when we consider the ideas around GLP, ALP, and then dual processor. And, are these distinct categories? How do you find, the demarcations? But also, can language processing, be as simple as boiling it down into 3 different categories? So those are things we want to really ask questions about.
Right. Our labels are only useful if we can, use them all the same way. So that's our inter-rater reliability. Another common one is test-retest reliability. So I will give you a link to 2 podcast episodes that focus entirely on inter-rater reliability, because this is huge in our kind of science. So now for test-retest reliability, it has test in the name, but it doesn't have to be a test. It's really just, if you do the same thing to the same person, do you get the same result? So so we expect kids to change in many ways over time. So you want to pick a time scale for retesting where you're not expecting change. All right. So if I give you the self today and a month from now, you should probably get roughly the same score. And so we can look at this for language sample scoring methods too, right? So your MLU this week, roughly the same as your MLU next week. We don't expect a ton of growth in a week. So if MLU is a reliable way to measure something about your language, not everything, it should be roughly the same week, from one week to the next. We can also look at this for DSS. So developmental sentence scoring, or NLA stages. So there's some research on MLU that it does vary by the situation. So MLU in snack might be different from MLU in play. So when we're doing test-retest reliability, we also want to make sure we're keeping as much the same as possible. And then when I was reading the 2012 book, Natural Language Acquisition on the Autism Spectrum, it kind of looked like there was some hinting that NLA scoring might have low test-retest reliability, because there was a case example of a child where it took several months to nail down a stage because they were very variable.
Yeah.
And so that's another thing we can test in quantitative research is, how much data, how many utterances for how much time do you need to get to a stable estimate that has test-retest reliability? Because again, how can we make clinical decisions based on a result of something that's not reliable, right? If it's really just if it's not telling us something about the child. Okay, so that's reliability. There's multiple mathematical formulas to calculate it that we don't need to know about. And there's other forms of reliability, but those are the 2 that really come to mind for these kinds of applications. So our last one is validity. So validity, we don't really show with math. It's more about kind of using logic and evidence to make a case that something is or isn't a valid measure. So validity deals with the degree to which evidence and theory support the interpretations of our clinical measure. So for a GLP versus ALP distinction, do we have evidence that there is a processing difference there? Certainly, it seems like there might be a communication style difference in terms of how much a child is using echolalia, but is there an underlying processing difference? So we need evidence of an underlying processing difference before we can have a valid use of a label of a processing style. And so, do we have that evidence? I think we don't yet have evidence of processing styles using methods of studying language processing. And so we need that evidence that we're measuring something. And same with the stages. Before using stages to describe language development, we need theoretical and other evidence that those stages are the best way to capture development. So showing data of a bunch of kids moving through the stages would be one thing, but also showing that those stages are a better way of capturing development than some other way to make evidence that this is a valid measure. And so another way to support validity is to show that it correlates with some other outcome measure. And so this is more for like standardized tests where you have another test that measures what you want to measure, and then you have your new test and you show that it correlates with the old one. For something like NLA scoring that's kind of new, or at least it's not designed as like the second way of doing something we already have established. You can't really use that kind of criterion validity, but you could show validity by saying, it measures something that we can't already measure. That's not captured by other things. And I don't think I've seen that research either, kind of justifying the use of the NLA scoring over other scoring methods. So when you hear researchers saying like, oh, it's not reliable, it's not valid, I think it's just helpful to know what those words mean and what it would look like to try to get there.
And I think to, almost do a callback to some of the first things we were talking about, it's that this opens up so many more questions than answers. When we think about all this, you're presenting ideas here that I hadn't thought of before about how to look deeper into this information. And, I've, in the beginning of connecting with these ideas of Gestalt processing and my excitement at the beginning, which I still have quite a bit of excitement. I mean, I can't imagine, wanting to investigate anything else in my field ever again, but also I really, really loved that there were 6 clear stages. Oh my gosh, what a treat that I get like something in my field that feels so solid. And then, over time, just realizing that there needs to be so much more that goes into thinking about those ideas to really be the best clinician that I can be and provide families with the highest quality of information that I can. And again, another callback to be fully informed participants in their child's treatment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's a great note to end on. I guess we do have a couple minutes for questions, so I'll let you cover that.
Well, yeah, I think as I say some final words here, if anyone would like to share a question or a comment yes, the slides will be made available with this episode. They'll be attached following this being put onto Speech Therapy PD. And what I did also want to share for those of you who are listening is that this course is available for 0.15 ASHA CEUs. If you're here, you probably already know that. And then if you're part of the ASHA registry and you want your CEUs reported, you must have your address in your profile, otherwise it will not be reported. To view your certificate of completion, you must go back into your Speech Therapy PD account, complete the course content, including the module, which is entitled Complete Course, and you need to allow 6 to 8 weeks from the day of completion for your ASHA CEUs to be reflected on your transcript. Okay. So Kathleen, thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciate hearing from you. I think that, like I said in the beginning, I've learned so much from you just about how to start thinking more deeply. I really appreciate it. You helped to diversify the way that I think about Gestalt processing and the ideas related to it. So I'm really grateful.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Corinne.
Thanks so much for joining us on today's podcast. Remember to go to speechtherapypd.com to learn more about earning ASHA CEUs. We want you to get credit for the hard work you've put in to further your education. We also appreciate your support. We'd love for you to write a quick review of the podcast and subscribe. If you're listening on a streaming platform, feel free to rate us. 5 stars is great, 4 stars is awesome, but we also appreciate honesty around here if it's lower. That way, your ratings and your reviews will help get our podcast to more clinicians like you, as well as parents and people from other professions who might benefit from learning about Gestalt language processing. Now, if you've indicated that you are part of the ASHA registry and entered both your ASHA number and a complete address in your account profile prior to the course completion, we will submit earned CEUs to ASHA for you. Please allow 1 to 2 months from the completion date for your CEUs to be reflected on your ASHA transcript. And also, please don't hesitate to tell us which topics you would like us to cover in future episodes. To get in touch, drop us a line in the comments section or send us a message on social media. We'd love to hear who you want us to interview, what topics are on your mind, and where you'd like us to investigate when it comes to the world of GLP. Okay, but here's the really cool part, especially because you listened all the way to the end. For our Gestalt Get-Together listeners, we actually have a special coupon code to receive $20 off any annual subscription to speechtherapypd.com. Head over there to get ASHA CEUs for listening to this podcast and all other episodes. My code is Gestalt20. You're going to put Gestalt in all caps, and that is GESTALT 20. I hope to see you at our next episode.